Okay, hi everyone. My name's Ellen Yeatman. I'm an ag economist with American Farmland Trust as well, and I work on our social science research team and am a part of the demonstration trials as well. And today I'm going to talk to you about, just share our insights from a 2025 National Biochar Survey I conducted. And I have to mention Aisha, she helped with this, and then my supervisor, Dr. Gabrielle Roche McNally, a rural sociologist, and Dr. Bianca Moibus-Clune as well, were a crucial part of this. So I'll quickly give you some background, and then I'll dive into our survey methods and share some of our survey results. And this is the first time I'm sharing these results with the public, so I'm really excited. And I'll end with next steps. So as y'all learned from Aisha, AFT was awarded a 5-year NRCS Conservation Innovation Grant to conduct our project Breaking Down Barriers to Biochar Adoption on Farms Coast to Coast. And as part of this project, we promised to conduct a survey of biochar early adopters. And presented in the diagram on the right there are our goals with this survey. So our foundational goal was to support the findings from our biochar demonstration trial, which is a relatively small sample size of 35 farms. And this is noted in the topmost hexagon. And moving clockwise through this diagram, specifically, we wanted to identify who and where these early adopters are. And in order to examine motivations and benefits, explore factors for success and persistence, examine challenges, and hopefully provide insights to increase adoption. And we developed and deployed this survey in partnership with NRCS, USBI, Cornell, and the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. So the first thing we had to decide for our survey method was who all was going to take this survey. As I mentioned, our primary audience is biochar early adopters, so specifically US farmers applying biochar. But we realized there are probably a lot more farmers that haven't applied biochar that might be interested, so we wanted to include questions for them as well. So our secondary audience is those farmers not using biochar yet, but interested. Finally, we also realized that non-farmers would maybe end up finding and trying to take this survey, so we wanted to include questions for them, but also filter them out quickly with a much shorter survey. So once we identified our audiences, we developed a 5 to 28 question survey, depending on which audience was taking the survey, put it into SurveyMonkey, and we deployed it from January 8th to April 4th of this year. And our outreach strategy to find these farmers was, first, we offered an incentive of 10 $100 gift cards that would be raffled off. We used our AFT email listserv, blasting the survey to over 55,000 emails. We did paid social media ads. We heavily relied on our project partners and reached out to biochar suppliers to conduct outreach through newsletters and social media. And we also heavily relied on AFT staff to send direct emails to our farmer connections and their professional network. And finally, promoted the survey at events and surveys and conferences. So as a result, we received 509 usable responses, of which 142 were non-farmers, but 367 were farmers, which was awesome. So 72% of our respondents were indeed farmers. And of the farmers, 218 were not applying biochar, so 60%, which is not too terribly surprising, but we had 149 respondents that are applying biochar, about 40% of the farmers that responded. And they took a longer form survey of 28 questions. Before we go any further, I just want to pause and touch on the non-farmers. So and this is the only thing I'll say about the non-farmers, the 142 that responded. They answered just 5 questions. They answered, are you a farmer? What state do you live in? What's your professional role? And what is your experience with biochar? And then an open-ended question as well. So just in terms of what their role was, these non-farmers were primarily just interested citizens, 34%. And then there were private ag industry professionals and non-farming landowners. But what the most interesting result, I think, from this non-farmer audience was we asked, what is your experience with biochar? 48% said none. And what that tells us is I think there's a lot of interest. That's why they're taking this survey, but they have no experience at this point. So a lot of opportunity to continue to educate and connect with biochar. So that's it for our non-farmer survey respondents. The remainder of my talk today will be focused on what we learned from our farmer respondents. So where were these farmer survey respondents from? This map shows the range of farmer responses received by state, with the darkest purple representing states with 32 to 43 responses by state, to the lightest purple representing just 1 response by state, and gray means 0 responses. So as you can see, we actually received farmer responses from across the country, from almost every state, even receiving 1 farmer response from both Alaska and Hawaii. We also received 2 farmer responses from the Virgin Islands, so that was fun. But the top 3 states where we received the most responses were Massachusetts, Washington, and New York, representing 31% of farmer responses. I will say that my hypothesis is that this most likely is due to the strong outreach by AFT staff in those states. That's where we have strong regional teams. And that also holds true for a lot of those states with like 11 to 19 responses per state. So with this vast area coverage, the farmer responses by state are relatively small sample sizes, which I'm highlighting here. So 34 of these states fall in this like 1 to 9 response rate. And this sample size gets even smaller when you're looking at just biochar users. So with that, I'm just going to present aggregate national results today, not by state at all. So our research questions were, are there predominant barriers to and motivations for biochar adoption? What characteristics are more likely to predict use of biochar? And do these characteristics vary geographically? So first, I'm just going to show you the results comparing biochar user and biochar non-user responses. We did ask for demographics. As I've highlighted here at the right of the table, there is no significant difference in demographics between biochar users and non-users. So I'm just highlighting what the dominant demographic was 80% white, 62% with bachelor's to master's degrees, 60% 35 to 55 years old, 59% female, so almost equal split female-male survey respondents, and 57% beginning farmers, meaning they had less than 10 years of experience, so almost equal split of beginning versus more experienced farmers that were responding to this survey. And beyond demographics, we asked all farmers about their farm characteristics. So this graph on the left is showing that there is a similar farm size distribution between biochar users and non-users. That y-axis presents the range of farm size acres, and the x-axis is the percent of each user group. The purple bars are non-users, and the green bars are biochar users. And there is a general trend happening here beyond the similar distribution that I noted by the vertical orange line. To the left of this line, the farm size categories are less than 50 acres, and there's a slightly larger percent of biochar users, while on the right, the farm size ranges are above 50 acres, and these categories have a larger percent of biochar non-users. So this is captured overall when we look at the weighted average farm size between these two groups, which I've written out in the second bullet. Biochar users' average farm size is less than non-users, at about 308 acres versus 449 acres. However, I ran some statistics, and farm size does not have a significant effect on biochar use. The next farm characteristic we compared is crops grown by these two groups. Respondents were asked to select all that apply from a list of crops. This table lists the crops in descending order for biochar users. The second column is the percent of biochar users, and the third column is the non-users that selected said crop. So as you can see, these two groups have the same top 5 crops, with most respondents growing vegetables and or raising livestock. Note, my highlight's gone. Note that there is only one significant p-value when I compared the non-user versus biochar user crops grown, and that's forage. So farmers growing, what I found, what that means here is farmers growing forage crops are significantly less likely to use biochar relative to farms that do not grow forage. So what I'm seeing there is there's a lot of opportunity to grow. So there's 20% of biochar users are, growing forage, yet 33% of non-users responded to this survey. So those 33%, they're obviously interested in biochar, they're just not doing it yet. So some room to grow in those perennial crops. Same with flowers. The p-value is 0.0517. So it's almost marginally significant. And the same thing there, I'm finding farmers growing flowers are marginally significantly less likely to use biochar. But no significant difference in crop production, which I was surprised by. One exciting finding that I found was there is a larger percent of biochar users that have organic status in terms of this pool of survey responses. So this graph here, we're looking at the green bars are the percent of organic non-users versus biochar users, and then percent conventional for non-users and biochar users. And when I ran some statistical analysis, organic stratification does have a significant effect on biochar use relative to non-organic status. So perhaps organic farmers are more likely to adopt biochar. This is the last farm characteristic slide I have. We asked all farmers, what practices from the following list are you currently doing on at least some of your acres crops? Select all that apply. What I found is in this table, I've demarcated by the horizontal dotted line, the top 4 practices are actually the same for both biochar users and non-users. These survey respondents all are already doing no-till or reduced-till, applying organic amendment, they've adopted cover crops, and doing soil nutrients. I thought it was interesting that if you look at the very last row of the table, none, it's showing that only a small percent of these respondents are implementing no conservation practices, so a fairly progressive group of farmers responding to this survey. I'm not showing the p-values here, but I did find that the only practice where there was a significant difference between these user groups, so maybe a predictor of biochar use, was organic amendments. So statistically speaking, farmers who apply organic amendments may be more likely to adopt biochar relative to farmers who do not apply organic amendments, which is not that surprising, because it's easier to integrate biochar if you're already doing organic amendments. So this is my final slide comparing biochar users versus non-users. We asked biochar users what their biggest challenge has been with applying biochar, while we asked non-users what their biggest barrier to adopting biochar has been. Both user groups listed availability and cost as the top 2 challenges and barriers. This was a common theme throughout the survey and probably not too surprising. I will say that in the second bullet I've noted here, not in the table, the 25% of biochar non-users selected difficulty accessing technical assistance versus only 10% of biochar users selected that. So not too surprising, those who have not yet adopted are having difficulty accessing technical assistance. What was really surprising is there was a lot more challenges and barriers listed in the survey for them to choose from. They're just not all shown here. One was negative yield impact concerns, and neither of these groups, the biochar users or non-users, had negative yield impact. It wasn't in their top 6 challenges or barriers listed of negative yield impact concerns. So that was interesting. So now we're going to look at just the biochar user responses. What are the characteristics of their biochar use? So for those that are already using biochar, it was a sample size of about 114 that responded to this specific question. And every time I've tried to list the sample size for each question answered in these slides. But the top 3 motivations were increasing soil health generally and or specific aspects of the soil, increasing crop yields, and increasing resilience to drought. Then we asked them later on in the survey what they actually observed with their biochar use. Their motivations actually align amazingly well with their observed benefits. The first two, the 41% said improved soil water holding capacity and more biological activity were observed benefits, which goes really well with their motivation to improve soil health. And the third top benefit was increased crop yields. 25% saw increased crop yields. And that, of course, aligns really well with their motivation to hopefully increase crop yields. So, of course, the number of responses per answer is a small sample size, so we must take these observed benefits with a grain of salt, but it's really heartening that people are seeing these benefits. In terms of what exactly these biochar users are doing, we asked various questions about their biochar use. The majority are using wood-based biochar, 90%. 12 right behind that was just 12% ag residue-based, 11% manure-based. The majority are blending with compost, 59%. Behind that was blending with manure, about 27%. In terms of the application strategy, about 43% said they were broadcasting with incorporation, or 28% were broadcasting without incorporation, followed by other. And when I read through did a qualitative analysis of what the other meant, it seemed like it was a lot of people using spreaders as well. These biochar users are mostly applying on select acres, not across their entire farm. One question that I really wish I would have asked is how many acres they're applying biochar to. I did not ask that, unfortunately. But they are, not surprisingly, not applying across their entire farm, even though the majority of these biochar users are quite small farms. I did average their application rate. It was about 2 tons per acre. The sample size there is 105 respondents, and their cost average was about 466 per tons with a sample size of only about 59. Many of the respondents selected that they made their own biochar, so that cost estimate, a lot of people didn't provide their cost estimate or preferred not to provide their cost. So the sample size, is a little lower for that cost average. So that brings me to, where are these farmers getting their biochar? 50% say they are making their own. 40% are sourcing from a local regional supplier. Respondents were allowed to select multiple answers in this case, so some did supplement their own biochar with purchased biochar, probably. But I wanted to know, is there a difference between these folks making their own biochar versus those purchasing biochar? Generally speaking, yes. I have not run statistical analysis on this yet, but in general, those making their own biochar relative to those purchasing biochar are smaller farms. Both are mostly applying biochar to vegetables, as we learned earlier. But those making their own were slightly more likely to grow and apply to tree fruits, which maybe that has to do with using prunings to make their own biochar on the farm. Less likely to grow and apply to row crops. So those purchasing biochar were more likely to be applying to row crops. Those making their own biochar apply slightly more and more frequently. So this is my final results slide. Great news, 54% of these biochar users said they are likely to continue applying biochar, an additional 26%, very likely, 54%, 26% said likely. So that's 80% of these biochar user respondents say they will continue applying biochar. So those are the results. First time sharing with the public, and my next steps are to continue running statistical analysis. I'm in the middle of assessing regional differences. I'm struggling with the sample sizes a little bit there. So maybe doing some east versus west comparisons. We want to, if we can, we're going to try and conduct some supporting interviews, so reach out to some of those survey respondents, provided their contact information. So we are hoping to reach out to some of them and support this quantitative data with some qualitative data. We are going to pursue a peer-reviewed journal article And then we're going to integrate results into AFT's upcoming Biochar Lessons Learned report, which will most likely be part of our awesome biochar online toolkit that Aisha showed y'all. And that's all I have for y'all today. I'm probably out of time. 2 minutes? Okay. I think I have a couple minutes for questions, if anybody has questions. Yeah. So his question is, one of the top observed benefits that folks rated was increased microbial activity. Unfortunately, this is just like an answer list we came up with that they chose from. So there was no like open-ended aspect for them to add more to. So yeah, we just put that as an option on the answer list. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah.
You showed on the one slide 59% were blending with compost, 27% with manure. Were the others applying raw biochar?
I don't know off the top of my head. That was an answer option, so I'd have to look. But I'm pretty sure that was a very low percent. Yeah. But I'll look that up for you. Look that up for you. Yeah, back there.
First of all, thank you so much for sharing the results of your survey. I just wanted to encourage you to reach out to the farmers that are actually using biochar and maybe take some time to develop some video content, et cetera, with them talking about what they're doing. I just think that it's great to see this in a survey, but a 30-second video clip of them talking about using it will be so important for all of us. So just encourage you to sort of do that next level and see what you can do with that, just to kind of as you're thinking about how you get other people involved to read your survey.
Right.
I think it could be super powerful and be great for the industry. So kudos, and just encourage you to do that.
That's a great idea.
Ellen,
Yeah.
Actually, thank you for saying that is actually part of our plan with the whole project.
Ah, I didn't know that. It's very exciting.
The folks who are, thank you.
Yeah.
The folks who are making their own, do you know how they're making it?
That's why we really want to do a follow-up interviews, because we don't have those details. We didn't do a follow-up open-ended question. We tried to limit the number of open-ended questions because of survey fatigue.
What's your hypothesis as to how they're making it?
I think, well, we saw that, at least, or it's not here, but a lot of them, those who are making their own, are more likely to be applying to tree fruits. And so using the hypothesis there is that they have all these prunings, so it's a natural transition to use them to make biochar. But other than that, they are saying 90% of folks are doing wood-based, so they must just have, I'm guessing, just a lot of wood-based stuff. Yeah. Debbie, do you have something to add?
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just add that.
Yeah, please.
I would say for the tree fruit, it is the annual prunings that they're using, or when they remove rootstock and have new plantings, and they have like whole trees potentially to burn. And often I've seen, at least on farms, they're doing it where they have a backhoe and they basically dug a hole, and then they drop the prunings in there and they burn it. Awesome. And then they'll mix it with any compost or manure they have on their farms as well. And you see this for vineyards as well. It's similar. But then also for small scale, it could be small scale kilns, like a Kentucky kiln or something like that.
Interesting. Great.
All question time or just
I
the
think,
last?
Yeah, it's open for all questions, about 10 minutes.
Yeah. This is a question for Kristen. Two questions.
should y'all come up
What
here?
proof do you have that they actually hit 700 degrees? Because what concerned is that all the research we're doing is likely to has fault because we really don't know what exactly we used without a char standard. That's the first question. The second question is, could you comment on the distance away? Because let's say 500 miles seems to be a long ways.
Oh, yeah. Oh, 100%. I don't know if we should go there.
You gotta come here.
Thanks, Debbie. So, all the charts that I talked about in the biochar the Pacific Northwest Biochar Atlas that are listed have temperatures associated with them, and most all of those biochars were produced in a lab, and so they were under really controlled conditions. So I have a lot of faith that the biochars mentioned in the Pacific Northwest Atlas are consistently at the correct temperature that they were made at. The ones that are going to be listed in the National Atlas, I'm not going out and doing QA, QC at people's biochar plants, so I really rely on the producers to give us good information. But I agree that there's really no verification of that number. And then your second question, I could not agree with you more. I think that understanding where biochars are at, and Debbie mentioned this too, like your first metric should be what's close to me, what's locally available, what's sustainable. And if you're talking the difference between, a biochar that has 15% ash or 20% ash, is that going to make a huge difference in your in the end benefits you get? The answer is probably going to be not that much.
Do you have a number to recommend? I'm using 50 miles, no more than 100 from where I want. I'm just trying to have a number.
I would have to look at an LCA analysis to do that, but I would say that, if you're talking about mineral fertilizer, a lot of people are importing that from across the globe. And so if you're going 100 miles to get your biochar, what's the carbon footprint of that compared to where you're getting your lime? It's probably not that different. I would say, my vision for this would be to have local ag suppliers truck it in big amounts so that it is available at your local Pradham co-op or your local nutrient distributor, so that we don't have to worry about trucking it from Qualterra or Oregon Biochar Solutions or whatever biochar producer you have locally. That is more of a distributor.
Yeah, I would just add to that. My colleague Johannes Lehmann, he did a techno-economic analysis a number of years ago, and they found that it was not cost effective beyond 100 miles.
Yeah, thanks to all y'all. I don't know which one of y'all should answer this, so just answer it how you like. When you are thinking about applying biochar and getting farmers to do it and trying to observe what happens, how important is it that you know how much biochar is there over time, or demonstrating that it's still there, or figuring out where it went? How do y'all think about the larger question of like fade and persistence? So I guess I'm asking in part because if you see some effect, but you're not sure it's there, or you're not sure how much is still there, then how do you feel about the cause and effect relationship?
Yeah, go ahead. Well, I don't know. I think it's. We can do the mass balance, right? So we can know how much we applied. The more difficult thing is coming back 2, 3, 5, 10, 20 years later and seeing how much is there. We know that biochar moves. Biochar especially moves on farm, where they are constantly moving farm equipment through that soil, whether it's on tires, whether it's on equipment, whether it's being tilled. That biochar moves, and so tracking it from birth to permanence is insanely difficult. We've tried to do it and have been incredibly unsuccessful. It moves downward in the soil, it moves across the soil. Animals move biochar. We put biochar in plots, and then a year later we find it in the plot next door to that plot, even though no farm equipment have moved in it. So there's moles, there's ground, it's really challenging.
Wind and water erosion.
Yeah.
No, wind and water erosion there too, for sure. If you don't get I've seen it in some trials I set up very early on, many years ago, where I just applied the biochar to the surface and only incorporated maybe 2-3 inches, and there was a heavy rain event, and that biochar was like 10 feet away the next day. So it definitely moves. I think taking into account Also, there's a lot of other things going on in the soil too. Obviously the physical breakdown, but the biological activity and the changes we see in the material itself that need to be taken into account too.
I'm curious to see, so we have, Earth Optics did their carbon mapping. Now, they didn't do it right, they did it right before we put in the biochar, so we don't have what the biochar looked like, at application. But it'd be interesting when they come back in 2027 and do that carbon mapping on those fields, what it looks like then.
Well, the other issue is that measuring carbon in soil is not super easy, right? I mean, if you're looking at standard deviations and the variation in equipment, you have to have a pretty dramatic change in your percentage of carbon to make note of it. So that technology is it's difficult to measure.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a couple of questions. From the first presentation, the question I want to ask is the results you get from using the app, does it take into consideration the depth at which you applied your biochar, as in terms of the implementation or incorporation? And with the question that was asked previously before mine, the depth at which you apply your biochar, incorporate it into the soil, will it be a factor to consider in seeing the goals that you set up to see? Like, let's say I want to increase my nitrogen content for the plants and what have you. Will the application, the depth at which you apply this biochar, aside the rates, will it also be a factor to consider? And then the recent one I have is, will blending biochar with other amendments reduce the rates at which you apply biochar? Let's say if you're applying raw biochar without any additions, maybe you would apply at 20 tons per hectare. But when you mix it up with, let's say, manure, you would have to reduce it. Is that all with these additions all add up to the factors that we need to consider when using biochar?
Yeah. So the answer to the first question is, in the National Biochar Atlas, it assumes you're using an acre furrow slice, which is about 6 inches of soil. So we use that because it's a lot easier than asking people how deep they're going to incorporate it, because a lot of people don't know the answer to that question. So we just use an acre furrow slice in that. In the spreadsheet that I showed, you can add in a depth to get a more precise number.
And I think your second question was about depth of incorporation and how that impacts things. So, I mean, depth of incorporation's definitely going to impact, I would say, potential outcomes. And also, I mean, it does depend on the cropping system you're applying to and how you want to incorporate it. I mean, as I mentioned in my presentation with perennial cropping systems, it's best to incorporate the biochar down into what will be the future rooting zone, or potentially the immediate rooting zone of that perennial crop. And so for tree fruit, for example, we don't necessarily want to be applying it to the top dressing on the top 2 inches of it, but we want to get down where we, either putting an auger hole when we're planting that tree, or if we have a strip tillage where we plant those, trenching that biochar down before planting those is really important. Because the biochar is going to then affect, at least initially, right, or in the immediate few years, that area in which it's applied, but over time, as we build more and more carbon, and there's physical movement and weathering of the biochar, it's going to get deeper into the soil profile as well.
Yeah, adding to that, let me put it this way. The research that you have done so far, was it a one-time application, or there's a periodic repetition of it?
For what?
In terms of applying the biochar to the soil, was it a one-time application, or is it something that has been applied from time to time?
I mean, it can be both. In the trials, the national trials that Aisha was talking about, we were talking about a single application. And for perennial crops, it's often a single application because you apply it to vineyards or tree fruit, and then that plant's in the ground for potentially decades. And so you don't really have another opportunity to apply it, but for annual cropping systems, you can make annual or subsequent applications. It's a lot easier. And so you have more opportunities to apply it, and the tillage depth, or the depth at which you incorporate, is gonna depend upon the farm, the equipment they have. There are many different factors that go into that incorporation depth. Sometimes growers want to apply it through a no-till drill because there are no-till farms, and that's a factor into its depth of incorporation. Or if you're applying a liquid biochar and applying it more on the surface and then kind of allowing microbial activity and physical movement to incorporate the biochar. So it's kind of tricky. There are many different factors happening there, I'd say.